trials in that setting, as I'll show you, or in the relapse setting, regardless of the line of therapy, if you're considering treatment and you have access to a CLL specialist or at least a blood cancer specialist, it makes sense to check in with them and see what your options are, just to potentially talk about trials, but even just to review what the recommended commercially available options are. So that's sort of my preamble on clinical trials. I would encourage you all to consider them when or if the time comes for treatment. I'm going to share my screen here, and there we go. So you should see my PowerPoint, and I'm going to start with a trial that actually recently closed at my institution, and that we're going to start all the way at the sort of easier to discuss phase 3 end of the spectrum. So this is, phase 1 has already happened, and they feel like that a treatment is safe. That's generally what a phase 1 trial is looking at, particularly phase 1A. Phase 1B is looking for, in a small number of patients, a treatment efficacy signal, and then you move on to phase 2, where you enroll more centers and more patients based on the safety and maybe preliminary efficacy data. And if you are encouraged by those results, the company then invests massive amounts of resources and dollars into a phase 3 trial in order to try to get FDA approval in other countries as well. So how you get approval for a treatment is to show that the treatment you are attempting to approve is ideally better than what's currently available. So you have to compare the treatment you're interested in to what we call the standard of care. So you have to pick a reasonable treatment option and then compare what you are investigating to that. So this study is called the MAGIC study. It actually completed its enrollment earlier this year. I actually put the most patients on this trial in the United States, so I can really speak to its overall benefits and what we're hoping for. But I just used it as a good example of a phase 3 trial where there's actually no investigational agents here. This trial is using available treatments and just using them in a different way. So where we have made a lot of progress in treating CLL is drugs. I mentioned ibrutinib, but we've now moved on from ibrutinib and have better BTK inhibitors with acalabrutinib and now zanubrutinib. But they're approved to be taken indefinitely for as long as they work. And they work incredibly, as I mentioned earlier, but we'd like to be able to maybe give them in a time-defined way. Well, we also have this other targeted drug called venetoclax that is given in a time-defined way. It's generally given with an IV treatment called obinutuzumab, which is a monoclonal antibody, but I've found that a lot of CLL patients, if they can avoid IV treatments, would like to do that. So the folks at AstraZeneca who make acalabrutinib wanted to see if we could give acalabrutinib with venetoclax on a time-defined way, and compare it to the standard of care of venetoclax and obinutuzumab. So this is not the first time that a BTK inhibitor has been combined with a drug like venetoclax. I actually also put a lot of patients on this Captivate study that looked at ibrutinib and venetoclax, and there was different arms. One of the arms used this really sensitive test that we have called minimal residual disease testing to look at, after a year's worth of the combination of ibrutinib and venetoclax, can you take patients off treatment, and how do they do compared to patients that continue ibrutinib. So looking at this top group of patients here, and how they compared is after they established that a patient was undetectable for MRD, patients either went on to ibrutinib or placebo. And what was really excellent, this is months down at the bottom, and this is progression-free survival. So this just means how long patients go before their CLL even ever shows up again. So the gray part is when they're on treatment, and you can see the patients that are on placebo here do just as well, statistically speaking. I know there is a slight numerical difference, but multiple years out, there's not a huge difference between whether the patients are on placebo or on ibrutinib, and overall these patients are doing quite well. So this is where the idea happened to be generated from for this MAGIC study. The combination of ibrutinib and venetoclax is actually approved in other countries. The FDA chose not to approve it in the United States for some complicated reasons having to do with the phase 3 trial, that they wanted basically an additional trial done because of the weak comparator arm for the phase 3 study that FDA didn't really necessarily consider as standard anymore. And the company that makes ibrutinib, because we now have these newer drugs, acalabrutinib and zanubrutinib, they, I think, as a business decision, didn't think it made sense to invest the money to do another a big global phase 3 study. But what's neat is even after stopping treatment, they've looked at the status of residual disease in these patients using that MRD testing. And even after stopping treatment, the patients, whether they're detectable or undetectable for measurable residual disease, there's just not much progression there. So the combination appears to be really effective, and this is quite different than the standard of care venetoclax and obinutuzumab, where I know this is sort of a complicated bar graph here, but these basically, the green values show the patients that are MRD undetectable. And we know, you can see that the green values go down over time, and after you stop the venetoclax at month 12, so over here on the left, and then once the venetoclax stops and the patients go on a treatment holiday, you can see slowly over time the disease recurs. And so those unchanging bars that I showed you on this previous slide appear to be different. So maybe BTK plus BCL2 is better, and maybe you can use the MRD, taking into account the patients that don't get to be MRD undetectable at the end of 1 year, and then give them treatment for an additional year. And you can see here in particular on the group that continued ibrutinib and venetoclax for an additional year, that the amount that achieved an undetectable state essentially doubled. So you can personalize treatment based on response using MRD. So that's all the background for the MAGIC study that looked at combining acalabrutinib and venetoclax to the standard of care venetoclax or obinutuzumab. And the study incorporated at the 1 year mark an MRD test to see who can stop treatment and who will keep going. And they actually are going to allow that, or did allow that for both arms. Large study, 600 patients, 1-to-1, and they mix up they try to balance the patients based on age and whether they had a chromosome 17 aberration, as well as the IGHV status. So for those that maybe haven't heard much about clinical trials before, this might be something that they didn't realize happens, that a clinical trial can be actually just using FDA approved treatments, but trying to use them in a better, smarter way, and not necessarily be experimental treatments. So if patients on this study can get to this undetectable measurable residual disease state in the blood, which which the study defined as if they take 100,000 white cells from the blood, can they see any CLL out of any of those cells? And if they can't, patients get to stop at 1 year. But if there is still CLL detected, they continue treatment for a full additional year. And so this is sort of how it looks laid out. So everybody will stop at 2 years if there's nobody that continues on for more than 2 years, whether you're on the standard venetoclax arm or the acalabrutinib venetoclax arm, that is what we call the experimental arm or the investigational arm. But if you're MRD undetectable on either arm, you can potentially stop at the end of 1 year. So it'll be because the study just completed enrollment in January. It'll be a few years before we get enough results to really hang our hat on, but it will be very interesting and to see these results. And I think it is a potential treatment that could affect a large number of patients, because if you change how first-line CLL treatment is managed, that's a potential huge amount of patients. And although we are looking at the combination of two available drugs, in the long term, we likely are going to be reducing treatment because the majority of CLL patients, if you look at the commercial data, are getting these single agent BTK inhibitors like acalabrutinib and zanubrutinib, which are given indefinitely for years and years. But if we do this approach, perhaps we can really time limit the therapy and give patients many years off treatment. You know, one of the criticisms of a study like this is if you use your good treatments up front, you know, are you going to be left with anything when you need something later, when or if? Well, luckily, the data indicates for the few patients that have progressed from that Captivate study that I showed you, that if you just give them ibrutinib or ibrutinib and venetoclax again, that they responded to retreatment. They're not when the disease shows up again, they're not the disease is not showing up with resistant mutations, and they respond to rechallenge. So you're not using up your treatment options. So the current study, so this is sort of my progression of BTK plus BCL2 inhibitor trials, which again I do think is going to change things in how we manage a lot of CLL patients. So I mentioned I put a lot of patients on Captivate and then led accrual on the MAGIC study, but not to be outdone. We have the BeiGene's approach to this, which is the maker of zanubrutinib. And so zanubrutinib now is looking at combining its BTK inhibitor with its own in-house made BCL2 inhibitor called sonrotoclax. And I'll talk to you a little more about sonrotoclax, but it's essentially an agent that is trying to improve upon venetoclax. Now, currently, venetoclax is the only BCL2 inhibitor. So as opposed to BTK inhibitors, which we have several now that are FDA approved, venetoclax represents the only BCL2 inhibitor. So BeiGene is attempting to make a better BCL2 inhibitor. There is single agent data to suggest it is it's quite potent and has a shorter half-life than venetoclax, 4.5 hours versus 26 hours. So you don't have to potentially worry about side effects if the half-life, you don't have to worry about side effects lasting as long if the half-life is much shorter. And it maybe even is active against some of the resistant mutations that happen in patients that progress on venetoclax. So there's been nice phase 1 data. It is not currently an FDA approved treatment though, as a single agent, and that those studies are ongoing. But this and this just shows some of the potency data that essentially it's at smaller levels inhibits BCL2 and potential other mutations where venetoclax requires much higher levels. This is sort of just updates in the study, but this is sort of how the study will look. It's a bit different than the MAGIC study, and I just started putting patients on this trial. But so again, the standard of care is still venetoclax obinutuzumab here. So this is another phase 3 study comparing to the standard of care. So half the patients get randomly assigned, and patients always ask if I have influence on where they get assigned. I don't. Half the patients will get randomly assigned to the standard of care, and half will get sonrotoclax plus zanubrutinib. So it's again this oral combination versus the standard of care combination with oral and IV. I think where the MAGIC study was a little more appealing is it used MRD, whereas this study does not. Everybody will stop at the end of 12 years of combination, and they'll look at progression-free survival again and compare and see what's better. So now shifting from phase 3 studies using mostly existing approved agents, or maybe a combination of an existing agent like zanubrutinib with a yet unapproved agent like sonrotoclax. Now we can back all the way up to a phase 1 study that I have opened, and we've sort of already discussed that venetoclax currently is the only BCL2 inhibitor that we have, and there's interest in developing next generation BCL2 inhibitors, just like we've developed next generation BTK inhibitors. So sonrotoclax is an effort at that, and the same company that makes venetoclax, AbbVie, is also doing this. So I have a phase 1 study with a next generation BCL2 inhibitor that doesn't even have, so when you start early with these drugs, they don't even have a name. So this is ABBV-453. And again, this is felt to be, potentially a more potent BCL2 inhibitor that'll be active in patients that have progressed on venetoclax. And at this point, because it's a phase 1 study, they're still actually, ramping up the dose and trying to find the right balance with the dose between toxicity and tolerability as well as efficacy. So that's a lot of what a phase 1 study does. And because we have really good treatments, typically, early phase studies are going to be in patients that have relapsed on multiple available options. So they're patients that are in general looking for options when they may not have good options with commercially available treatments. And so that's sort of another side of clinical trials, but certainly there are a lot of clinical trials, even as I showed you a couple for patients in the frontline setting. And then there's another sort of hot topic for finding new targets. I've mainly only talked about existing targets and combinations of them with BTK inhibition and BCL2 inhibition. And now this isn't necessarily a new target, but it's a new approach to addressing a target that we've had a lot of success with, which is BTK inhibition. But this is you might have heard of this, these compounds looking at degrading the BTK. So essentially creating a compound, this one's still, again, because it's early in its development, called BGB-16673. It is a BTK degrader. So instead of inhibiting Bruton's tyrosine kinase, it degrades, enzymatically degrades the compound. And so it is theoretically and has some early phase data showing that in patients that progress and develop mutations at BTK that have been on BTK inhibitors like ibrutinib or acalabrutinib or zanubrutinib for a long time, that they still are susceptible to treatment with a degrader. And BeiGene's making one. There's another company named Nurex that's making a degrader. So that is an example of another early phase study going on. And as you can see, here is an example of where that you might be on a phase 1 study that maybe isn't just looking at patients with CLL. There's these trials called basket trials, and because CLL is one of many B cell malignancies, they're interested in if this compound works in CLL, but also other lymphomas like mantle cell lymphoma, marginal zone lymphoma, and they list Waldenstrom's lymphoma here, and even some more aggressive lymphomas on the right, like Richter's transformation and DLBCL, along with another indolent lymphoma, follicular lymphoma. So this is a basket study, which early phase looking at multiple options. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, and here we go. All right. And we're coming right up on the half hour, which was my target for allowing enough time to take questions. But certainly this was not a comprehensive review of all interesting clinical trials out there for CLL. That would take a lot more time. But what I was trying to do was paint a picture of the different kinds of clinical trials that are out there, all the way from phase 3 to phase 1, and hopefully educate you that there are trials for really most all scenarios out there, depending on what institution you're at and what trials they have open, but they can be as simple as taking existing treatments that are FDA approved and looking at better ways to use them, or for the patient that has progressed on many lines of therapy and needs something, needs access to something because there's just not good commercial options out there. There are earlier phase studies, for patients such as this, with agents that are earlier in their development. So I hope I've done that. I'm happy to take questions on maybe some other trials you've heard about as well.
Thank you for that great presentation. Like Dr. Jacobs said, now is the time for questions. So if you have any questions about clinical trials for Dr. Jacobs, feel free to ask them. You can either unmute yourself and ask or raise your hand. As a reminder, so raise your hand using the little reaction symbol, or just unmute yourself. This is recorded, so if you don't want to turn your camera on, that is understandable. You are not required to, but you are more than welcome to. And if you do need to hop off prior to completing our Q&A event, that's fine. You'll still have access to that survey as well as the recording, so you'll get that after the fact. But we do ask that you complete that survey prior to fully getting off. So looks like first question comes from Gary. I'm a 76-year-old male on 10-year watch and wait, getting ready to start zanubrutinib or Brukinsa.
Yeah. Yeah.
I only have one kidney. Is Brukinsa a better choice than venetoclax?
Yeah, it's great question. And that's a great watch and wait period that Gary got to have there. It's part of the reason why, even with our newer treatments, we still don't just jump into treatment right away. There's many patients that can go many years before they need treatment. So if Gary had met an oncologist that told him 10 years ago he needed treatment, he would have gotten chemotherapy. And we've got all these better treatments available to us now. So it's very likely, if you're on active surveillance now, if you do end up there are some patients that don't end up needing treatment, but if you do end up needing treatment, which most patients do ultimately need treatment, in the future we probably will have a better option than what we what we do even now. So it looks like zanubrutinib was recommended, maybe specifically because of the choice with one kidney. That's a real specific question. Certainly, I can say zanubrutinib is safe from a kidney standpoint. It is cleared by the liver. It doesn't really have significant effects on the kidney. The more concern about the kidney is not that venetoclax is toxic directly to kidneys. It's that depending on how much disease bulk you have, that venetoclax, along with the obinutuzumab, can be sort of a stress on the kidney, particularly when you start treatment. So the venetoclax and the obinutuzumab kill a lot of CLL quick, and that's why they produce those deep responses, and that's why the treatment holidays are there. After being on treatment for a year, you can stop for what looks like many years before needing treatment again. So the answer to Gary's question is it depends. I would and it has to do with the comfort level of your oncologist. Certainly having one kidney can influence the decision, but I wouldn't say having one kidney rules you out of having time-defined treatment with venetoclax and obinutuzumab. Of course, I don't have access to your labs and such, so there's as well as a knowledge of how much disease bulk you have. So it's sort of a complicated question, but having one kidney does not just in and of itself rule out venetoclax. Zanubrutinib is certainly a safe choice there. And yeah, sorry, Dalton, you can go ahead with the next one.
Oh, not a problem. That was a great answer. Next question comes in from Sarah. Is the MAGIC study looking at treatment naive or relapse refractory patients?
And I apologize if that wasn't clear. It is definitely treatment naive. So there is data out there to suggest, not surprisingly, that BTK plus BCL2 works in the relapse setting. But in the novel era that we're in, by the time most patients have relapsed, they have seen either BTK or BCL2 at this point. So really these studies looking at combinations of BTK plus BCL2 are mostly all in the first line treatment setting. So that, Captivate was the same way, MAGIC's the same way, the Celestial study with zanubrutinib and sonrotoclax is the same way. The idea is you hit the disease hard in the first line setting, and then maybe can go many, many years without ever needing treatment again.
So next one from Susan. I'm going to do my best to pronounce this one. Not one I've heard a lot about, but are you able to comment on any trials involving epocritinab for
Epcoritamab.
CLL?
Yeah. I like epcoritamab. I'm a lymphoma specialist. I trained at MD Anderson and CLL at Anderson, and I know at Sloan Kettering they have CLL in the leukemia department there, but I'm actually a lymphoma. We have CLL, as most of these patients know, it's a leukemia, it's a lymphoma, it's both. So it really fits for both. So I'm a lymphoma. We have CLL in our lymphoma division here, and so I treat a lot of other patients with lymphoma as well. And epcoritamab has multiple approvals in other lymphomas. So I like epcoritamab. It's a good bispecific antibody. I didn't mention it in the available or sort of trials of interest at this point because it's one of these that sort of like CAR T cell therapy is probably going to be restricted to the space of patients that have relapsed on multiple oral targeted therapies, just because these bispecifics and CAR T especially involve quite a bit more toxicity monitoring, and of course there's the infusions and in inpatient hospital observation periods. So just a lot more goes into these. Luckily, with the excellent treatments we have that are quite well tolerated, they're a little more hands off. I do really am intrigued by the early phase epcoritamab data. I actually have been part of developing another bispecific antibody that that's had success in other lymphomas that we're also looking at in combination with a BTK inhibitor in CLL, but it's that trial's not even open yet. So where I think the excitement is with a drug like epcoritamab is it's a potential option for patients that have moved beyond BTK and BCL2 and need other options. So that's one. We're always looking for more options in what we call these double refractory patient populations where we don't have good treatments. But two, there's some that wonder, if you get epcoritamab and maybe combine it with some of our other options down the road, can you get even deeper remissions and maybe, is in theory, can you cure CLL patients if you sort of do this combined approach of having like a bispecific antibody with other targeted agents. So I'm paying very close attention to the development of epcoritamab in this space.
And that kind of, I think, is a really good segue into our next question from Kim. What trials are available for relapse patients following BTKI and BCL2 therapy? Would that epcoritamab be a good option potentially for
Yeah,
that?
if I certainly would strongly advocate for a patient to participate in an epcoritamab trial if there was one. I mentioned, at my institution, I've got the next generation BCL2 inhibitor that's available. I also have a basket trial with a MALT inhibitor, which is just a different target. So you'll hear ROR1, kinase inhibitors being a good oral targeted agent out there that's available in this space. And then the degraders, if you can find a institution, and there are many now that have, one of the two compounds that are BTK degraders open, that would be a good trial to look at. And there's, I had a patient of mine that wanted to go just talk to some other specialists. Well, I offered him the MALT inhibitor, and he ended up getting on a trial with another type of BTK inhibitor at a different institution that's called a non-covalent BTK inhibitor, which is there's more than one out there under development. So there's lots of options. That's great. Sometimes patients are limited in terms of what institutions they have access to, but if you have access to any of those, I think they would be good. In terms of what's commercially available, thankfully, as of 2024, we had two new treatment options approved for patients that have need options beyond the traditional BTK and BCL2 treatments. So pirtobrutinib was approved in January, and that is our first non-covalent BTK inhibitor, and it is effective still in most patients that have progressed on a drug like ibrutinib, or presumably acalabrutinib and zanubrutinib. And then, as I mentioned earlier, or alluded to earlier, CAR T cell therapy, that is now approved as of a few months ago for multiply relapsed CLL patients. So we do have some commercial options for those patients as well.
Lynn's raising their hand. Would you like to go ahead and ask your question?
Yes, I have been on zanubrutinib for a little over 2 years, and I'm treated in New York City by a CLL specialist, and I was put on venetoclax for 5 months. I ramped up to 400, didn't feel good, then got neutropenia, and they lowered my dose, I think, to 200. But I did not feel good. I was short-winded. I had a headache, and I was taken off of it for a few months, and then we retried it at 100 milligrams. And I was on it for 4 weeks and still did not feel good. I just was fatigued, short-winded, had a headache. Do you have any other patients that get this reaction? And if so, how do they deal with it?
Yeah, and just for my just so I have the whole story. So you were they added venetoclax on top of that. You continued the zanubrutinib, and then you got the venetoclax added on top of it.
Yes, because my doctor felt I'm very high risk, that it would put me more into minimal residual disease, which, by the way, I'm at 0.03 as of this week.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but I did not feel good on that drug. I
sure.
tried.
And it sounds like this was not done on a clinical trial, right?
No.
Okay, so you're in this interesting space where you probably are seeing. It wouldn't even surprise me if I know your your oncologist, but um, sometimes specialists like us can get away with things that's called off-label
Right.
treatment. So what you are getting is there's not a lot of whereas opposed to an FDA approved treatment option, we have a lot of experience to reference. In this situation, it's off label. So yeah, there's some data out there with zanubrutinib and venetoclax. It's early phase. So but the follow-up's not very long. So but having given a lot of these combinations, BTK plus BCL2, I will say, thankfully, that most of the people tolerate treatment well, and it doesn't seem the combinations don't seem to produce new toxicities because of the combination. Like the toxicities that are there are what we know exist with the drugs independently. So clearly, in your situation, you were tolerating the zanubrutinib well, and it's the venetoclax that you don't tolerate very well. My experience is, although in general I find venetoclax to be a well-tolerated drug on these combination studies, if there is an issue, it does tend to come up with venetoclax. I would say more often than not, it's the blood count, like the neutrophil count specifically, ends up being too suppressed, or other count suppression is a problem. But sometimes it's just how it makes patients feel. They did the right thing by trying to go down all the way to 100 milligrams. And unfortunately, it sounds like there's just a tolerability even at that 25% of the intended dose. So it does sound like you've had a real nice response. What's great is, and I don't know if zanubrutinib was your first therapy, but what is great about zanubrutinib, and the BTK inhibitors in general, but zanubrutinib specifically has data that show even the highest risk patients with the chromosome 17 aberration, it doesn't seem to matter long term whether you have chromosome 17 aberration or not. If you're on zanubrutinib, you do really well. So I wouldn't get discouraged that because you couldn't tolerate the venetoclax that means you're not going to have a good outcome. And there'll be other options down the road. I think we're not too far away from having next generation BCL2 inhibitors available, like I talked about, like sonrotoclax, for example.
Thank you.
Yeah. I do really like this question from Deborah. I kicked myself for not thinking to address that. I try not well, I just have my scientist blinders on, and not always thinking about costs, but obviously costs are a huge deal to patients. In general, that's costs is one of the things we're excited about with potential for time-defined therapies, because you're taking a drug like zanubrutinib that works so well, you can have patients on it for 10 plus years, and maybe trying to find a way to give it for just a year. And so that obviously would reduce cost a lot, and you know, potential toxicities if you're limiting the time on therapy as well. So the cost issue on trials is always an interesting discussion. We would but the main thing I would like for you know, the audience to take away is being on a clinical trial should never cost you more than getting treatment outside of a trial. And in a lot of circumstances, it will actually cost less. But it should never add to your cost. So we do think it would be nice if every patient that was on a clinical trial had all their treatment and all their care paid for. And I think a lot of pharmaceutical companies would even be happy to do that because, you know, they ultimately want to get a drug approved and that's how they make, you know, their money. But the problem is for if you pay for all the care and treatment on a clinical trial, there's ethical issues there because then people that are financially motivated because of maybe lack of finances, that they will seek out clinical trials more aggressively, just so they can afford treatment. And then you get this potential scenario where it looks like you're experimenting on you're in particular experimenting and doing your studies on those of less financial means. And so they don't want to create that ethical quandary. So what they do is try to help in areas where it makes sense, but understanding they can't pay for everything. So every trial's different. The main thing again is that a trial should never add more cost, and where a trial will clearly be cheaper is any treatment that is not commercially available, they can't charge you for. So if you're getting if you're going on a trial with a drug, even if it's FDA approved in so say that epcoritamab study, even if it's approved in another kind of lymphoma, they can't make you pay for it to get treated for CLL because it's not approved. So anytime you go on a study and you're getting a treatment that's not approved, or a combination of treatments that aren't approved, the treatment itself is paid for. So that's really nice. So for example, the MAGIC study, they paid for both the acalabrutinib and venetoclax because they're not approved to be given together by the FDA. So they couldn't charge your insurance for that. And you know, these targeted treatments are all north of $100,000 a year in terms of cost to the insurance. So that's a huge benefit from a cost standpoint. Some trials, you know, phase 1 trials, phase 2 trials, they don't have standard of care arms. So all the treatment on a phase 1 or a phase 2 study would be paid for. On phase 3 studies, you know, anything that's not approved in the area is going to be covered. And then so the sometimes where it gets complicated though is the standard of care arms on phase 3 studies are often billed to insurance because they are standard of care. But sometimes there are trials where even the standard of care arm is covered. Like for example, the MAGIC study, they did cover the venetoclax on the standard of care arm as well. Well, the venetoclax and the obinutuzumab. But treatment is only part of the cost. You know, for every clinical trial that opens at my institution, and most institutions have similar processes, we review what the trial is going to require in terms of how often are patients going to have to come in, how often are they going to have to get labs, how often are they going to have to get scans? That's a big one. Scans are costly. How often are they going to have to get things like a bone marrow biopsy or such? And I go through, and as the principal investigator on the study, I go through and pick apart everything and say, that's standard of care, that's not standard of care, that's standard of care. So getting a scan every 3 months is not standard of care. Honestly, even getting a scan every 6 months isn't necessarily standard of care. So anything that's considered not that I deem not standard of care in terms of follow-up is going to be billed to the pharmaceutical company, because I said that's not what I would usually do outside of a trial. So very complicated, but I think as long as you answer, but as long as you take away that, being on a clinical trial shouldn't cost you more.
All right, we are getting to the end of our time here. So thank you again, Dr. Jacobs. That was fantastic. And I think those were some really good questions, and you did a fantastic job answering them. Before we hop off, I do want to highlight a feature of CureHub, and that is the treatment options and clinical trial finder that we have within CureHub. So once you've connected your medical records to CureHub, you can start exploring a wealth of information about ongoing clinical trials and treatment options that are available for your blood cancer. This information can help make informed decisions and prompt important conversations with your doctor. On the screen, I have the link for the sign up for CureHub, along with the email address for our patient navigators who are available to help you with an account and connecting your records. I'll also include some information about how to enroll in CureHub in our follow-up emails, so look out for that. I do want to bring attention to a couple of upcoming events that we have. On Monday, September 30th, we will have a Innovations for Blood Cancers. This will be all blood cancers that we sponsor here at HealthTree. So that'll be pretty exciting. Get to see some of the new work that's coming out, not just for CLL, but all blood cancers, and see the amazing work that physicians around the world are doing. Tuesday, October 1st. So those ones are back-to-back days. We have another important one. This is going to be upcoming changes to Medicare for 2025. And then on Friday, October 11th, we have things to think about when choosing a CLL treatment, and that will be with Dr. Joanna Rhodes. So again, as you leave today's session, we would appreciate you taking 2 to 3 minutes to fill out a brief survey about your experience with today's event. And finally, I just wanted to say thank you for helping us build our CLL community here. I've added my email address to this slide. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me about any questions about HealthTree, any of our programs, ideas for different webinar topics, anything. I'm here to really help get you connected with HealthTree. And I love to interact with the members of our community. So I appreciate you all, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. I hope to see each of you at another webinar soon. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.